Hey guys, so we're going to be talking about the skeletal system today. This is from chapter 6 in your textbook. This is part 1. There's actually 2 parts for chapter 6. We're going to discuss the general functions of the skeletal system. We are going to name and locate the skeletal landmarks on the human skeleton. We're going to describe the general structure of a bone. There's many different parts like the periosteum, the epiphysis, the medullary canal, and explain the functions of each part. And we're going to distinguish between compact and cancellous bone in terms of their microscopic structure, their function, and their locations. So the skeletal system is going to develop from the mesoderm. Remember we talked about those 3 germ cell layers. We had the endoderm on the inside, the mesoderm in the middle, and then the ectoderm on the outside. So this is the mesoderm. What is actually contained within the skeletal system? Well, we're talking about the bones. Bones, the fancy name is osseous tissue, and cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. So if you remember, bones are actually, we talked about our different tissue types, right? And so that is a connective tissue. So the function, your skeletal system's job is to support the body. And one of the ways that it supports the body is by being really strong, but also flexible, right? And so the facilitating movement part, there are points of attachment for our muscles. And because of those points of attachment, it allows us to be able to move at joints, right? But also, like I said before, with the support of the body, it is hard, but also flexible. It protects our internal organs, so the skull, the rib cage, and the vertebral column. Those are all protecting our internal organs. It helps to produce blood cells. It does what's called hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is really fun to say. You guys practice. Say hematopoiesis. Great. So that's done within the red marrow. There's energy storage here. We actually have fat within and minerals within the yellow marrow. Okay. And mineral storage, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium are all stored within our bones. Okay. So your skeleton is really cool because it actually has the ability to adapt. And what it does is it's called remodeling. Okay. And so remodeling actually occurs based on gravity and muscle pulling. So every time we lift weights, for instance, every time we're walking, every time we're fighting against gravity and our muscles are pulling against our bones are actually remodeling their structure and becoming stronger. Now, there are some things that will affect our ability to remodel. One of them is diseases. You may have heard of scurvy. Scurvy is a disease that occurs in pirates. Or just anyone who's going to spend a long period of time on the sea because they are losing their vitamin C. They don't have any citrus fruits, so they don't have the vitamin C. And that will actually give us some holes within our bones. They're not as structurally sound as they could be. And nutrition. So that was a disease that had to do with nutrition. There is that vitamin C as well. But also calcium and vitamin D are imperative for our bone or our skeletal structure. Okay. So let's talk about these different bones. They are bones that are classified based on their shapes. Okay. So we have these long bones. They are longer than they are wide. Some examples would be the femur, which is right here in the leg, the humerus, which is right here in your arm, the metacarpals. Metacarpals are going to be the bones right here in the palm of your hand, the phalanges, which are the fingers, and also the toes, and your ulna. Right? And so the ulna is right here on the pinky side. We have short bones. Okay, and so short bones, just like they sound, they're going to be short. They are usually a little bit cube-shaped, and so those are going to be the carpal bones. Those are in the wrist, and the tarsals, which are in the ankles. We have irregularly shaped bones. These are very complex, and their shape actually determines their role. So the vertebrae, right here, facial bones that we're going to look at, like for instance, the zygomaticus, that is an irregularly shaped bone. We have flat bones, so the sternum, which is right here in the center of your chest, your ribs are considered flat bones, the scapula, which is on the back here, your shoulder blade, and your cranial bones, which are going to be a part of your skull up here. And then we have sesamoid bones. They are shaped like a sesame seed almost. So we have the patella, and then some of the bones within our hands and our feet are also going to be sesamoid bones. These are small and round bones. So remember that osseous tissue, again, is a connective tissue, and connective tissues have to have three things, right? We have to have those extracellular fibers, we have to have ground substance, and then we have to have the cells themselves. So in this case, we're going to talk about these cells. These are called osteoblasts, and we've already talked about that suffix blast, right? And so those blasts are those builders, right? So they are building and releasing out those fibers, and osteo means bone. So these are fiber builders for bones, right? Osteoblasts. We have a matrix here. Now the matrix is actually hard. It's a mineralized ground substance. So it's been mineralized, meaning that we're storing our minerals in there. And they have been embedded in collagen fibers, right? So there's our fibers, there's our ground substance. That's going to give us our extracellular matrix. These are those cells, right? We require that for connective tissues. Now, we have two different types of matrix happening here. We have an organic matrix and an inorganic matrix. So remember, organic means that it contains carbon, inorganic means it does not, right? And so collagen is actually an organic material, and proteoglycans. Proteoglycans, remember, they help to hold water. And then we have our inorganic matrix, which is the calcium phosphate crystals. And these calcium phosphate crystals actually harden and create this material called hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite. Fun word also. Okay. So these are those different types of bone cells. So we have our stem cells, right? These are osteogenic, and they can go on and become any of these other types of cells. We have the osteoblasts. The osteoblasts are the ones that are creating or building that matrix, right? And these help with bone growth. We have osteocytes. Osteocytes are mature bone cells. Okay, site means cell, osteo means bone, bone cells. And then we have osteoclasts, and osteoclasts are called bone resorbing cells. What does resorbing means? It means that it's breaking it back down, okay? It's sort of clashing with it and breaking it down. So these, what does each one do, right? So those osteogenic cells can develop into osteoblasts. The osteoblasts are going to create the bone. They continue to grow portions of the bone, including in the periosteum and the endosteum. We're going to talk about the areas in just a second. The osteocytes are maintaining that mineral concentration, and then the osteoclasts are the bone resorption. So they're reabsorbing the bone. And this is how we do remodeling with all these different types of cells. Okay. So what does a bone look like? So let's talk about our bone structure. It starts as that connective tissue, and it's going to mature to include the bone, the blood vessels, the muscles, and some nervous tissue to make the final structure. Now, there's two different types of bone tissue or osseous tissue. Okay? So up here, you can see this looks sort of spongy, and so we call that spongy bone. We also call it cancellous bone, cancellous with a C. And then we have compact bone right here. Okay, so we have the spongy bone and we have the compact bone. So you'll see we have sort of this spongy bone or cancellous bone here. And then along the edges, we have all this compact bone. And so what we have is different areas of the bone. So we have the epiphyses. Epiphyses for more than one, epiphysis for one of them. Okay? And they're going to be the ends. We have a proximal epiphysis. So remember, proximal means closer to the attachment point, right? And so this is going to be that attachment area. Then we have the diaphysis, which is sort of the shaft of the bone. And then we have our distal epiphysis. Remember, distal means further from that attachment point. So this bone right here is a humerus that we're looking at. So if we said it was the humerus, then this would be the part that's going to fit up into the shoulder. And then this would be where your radius and ulna would attach. So we would have our elbow in there, okay? So what we can see here is that in the center of the diaphysis, we have this yellow bone marrow, right? And that's where we're going to store some minerals, but also fat. Okay? Here is compact bone surrounding it. And then we have our periosteum. Peri means around, osteum means bone. So it's this covering that covers over all around the bone. Okay? You can also see all these blood vessels in there. These are arteries to actually give us the blood supply to the bones, because these are cells, and so they require oxygen and nutrients, and then they need to take the carbon dioxide back out. Okay? So these different types of bone, right? So we have compact and we have cancellous. Compact bone, it is very tightly packed together and it is 20% of the structure of our bone, but 80% of the weight. It is very dense tissue and it's filled with those mineral deposits in the collagen matrix, that hydroxyapatite, and it creates what are called osteons. Okay? And then the cancellous bone is 80% of the structure, but only 20% of the weight. There's lots of open spaces here you can see between what are called the trabeculae. This is the trabeculae here that's sort of forming that structure of the bone. And then we have all these little holes in there. And that allows the bone to be much more flexible. So spongy bone has these cavities that contain red marrow in them. You can see that. Compact bone forms osteons, okay? And so this circular area right here is called an osteon. And then down the center of each osteon is what's called a haversian canal. It's also called a central canal. And it goes right down each of the center of the osteons. And that in the center of there, we're going to find all of the vessels, okay? And the reason that we have to have that, right, is because it doesn't have all those holes that the blood vessels and the nerves can all just grow through. Instead, it has to have this area. Now, these concentric circles called lamellae, and you can see those nerves. Now, we also have what are called perforating canals. They're also called Volkmann's canals, and they go side to side. Okay? So they come off the central canal or off of that haversian canal. You can see that periosteum is still there. Remember that periosteum is covering over the outside of the bone. So here you can see that cancellous or the spongy bone right there. And this is compact bone. Right? So there you can see those haversian or the canals or the central canals. You can see the lamellae, circles. You can see the perforating or the Volkmann's canal right there coming across. And there's that spongy bone. Right? And so spongy bone again has this sort of trabeculae, and then in the center it has some areas of adipocytes, which are fat cells. So this is that long bone. Right? This one's actually a femur. Okay, so also a long bone. It's covered over by that periosteum. The diaphysis is the shaft. And then you might notice that there's an epiphyseal line. The epiphyseal line is another form for a growth plate. And that is actually going to get smaller as you grow larger. And then we have our hyaline cartilage here along the edges. It's called the articular cartilage. And that's because it is at an area of articulation. Articulation is a place of joints coming together. Joints coming together, articulation. Okay. And so you can see the spongy bone here along the epiphyses. And then we also have all that red marrow in there. Okay, so that's where we're going to do hematopoiesis. And then we have the yellow bone marrow here along the diaphysis. Okay. And so that's where we're going to store all of that extra fat cells, and the vitamins and the minerals can be stored in there. Okay. So what happens is that as we grow, our bone marrow changes. Okay, so we have this bone marrow cavity here in the center, and we have all this spongy bone, and it's lined with the endosteum. The endosteum is on the center of the bone. If we have the periosteum on the outside, we have the endosteum here on the inside. Okay, and so that's going to help us to make new bone. We have this yellow marrow that's made up of those fat cells, and it's a food supply for our bone cells. Okay. And the yellow marrow can actually be converted into red marrow when our body suffers severe blood loss, right? So you can see that as we become an adult, we lose a lot of the red marrow and it moves just out here to the outer areas, okay? But if your body suffers severe blood loss, we can actually convert the yellow back to red. So how does bone grow and how does it remodel? Okay? Our skeleton is made up of cartilage and bones, right? And so an embryonic skeleton, this would still be within the stomach or within the uterus, okay? The embryonic skeleton is made out of hyaline cartilage. And in a young child, most of that cartilage has been replaced by bone. You can see that here. Most bones develop using the hyaline cartilage as the model, okay? But we also have some flat bones, and flat bones actually do what's called intramembranous ossification. They have a fibrous membrane within them, okay? Ossification is just a fancy word for bone formation, and they do that with osteoblasts. Remember, those are those building bone cells. And so what they do is we have sort of this hyaline cartilage that's already there. That's shown with the blue here in the picture. Okay. And then we're going to get new bones sort of covering over that hyaline cartilage using those osteoblasts. Once we enclose that hyaline cartilage, it gets digested in the center, and that leaves us that medullary cavity behind. Remember, two regions are going to remain cartilage. We have that articular cartilage and the epiphyseal plate. And then once you become an adult, it becomes an epiphyseal line. So the epiphyseal plate is that layer of hyaline cartilage, and it's between the epiphyses and the diaphyses at the ends of those growing long bones. It's going to grow and be replaced by bone for linear growth to make these bones longer. That linear growth actually starts in a fetus, and it continues all the way until the end of puberty. Growth hormone triggers the growth at that epiphyseal plate, but estrogen and testosterone stop it. On the epiphyseal side of that plate, those chondroblasts, they create new cartilage. They push that epiphysis away from the diaphysis. And then on the diaphyseal side, old cartilage is going to continue to calcify, and it gets dissolved by those osteoclasts. Remember, osteoclasts are those bone cells that are breaking it down. Okay? Osteogenic cells are going to move in, they undergo mitosis, they create osteoblasts, which can continue to lay down new matrix for that connective tissue. Again, that growth at that epiphyseal plate is going to continue until the end of puberty when the cartilage calcifies and becomes the epiphyseal line. And that happens due to those increasing sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. Okay? So here is just sort of showing you this in a picture. Okay? So on the epiphyseal side of the plate, the chondroblasts create that new cartilage. They push the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. So you can see that happening, right? Then on the diaphyseal side, the old cartilage calcifies and is dissolved. Here's that calcium, and we see some cell death happening. The osteogenic cells are going to move in and undergo mitosis to lay down new matrix right here. And then that growth continues until we hit puberty. We can also have what's called appositional growth, and this is where we grow in width, so the bones actually get wider, and this is what happens with that remodeling a lot, right? So the bones can actually grow in width in response to weight-bearing forces and tension that's exerted by muscles within the tendons. So if you do a lot of exercise, we're going to get to see that appositional growth, right? Manual workers tend to have a larger clavicle. The clavicle is your collarbone right there at your, like to the edge of your throat, above your, right around your shoulders. Okay. And so that's going to get larger because they're doing a lot of weight bearing exercise or weight lifting of boxes or what have you. And that's going to cause that the clavicle to grow wider. It occurs into the periosteum, and it does it throughout childhood until about the mid-20s. Dominant arm use. So if you exercise like playing tennis, then we're going to get appositional growth in the arm that gets used. And there's also increased appositional growth with obesity because of extra weight bearing of that extra weight. We're going to watch a quick video about bone remodeling. Okay, so that was bone remodeling. I hope that you enjoyed our video, and also it's very calming. You can almost do yoga to that music. So let's talk a little bit about bone fracture. These are some examples of bone fractures. Okay, so this is a normal bone, no fracture there. Okay, you can see a transverse fracture named because of the way that it breaks. Open or compound means that it's pushing up against the skin, or it may even break the skin. Oblique is sort of like a side or an angle. Okay, we can also have it displaced. Comminuted is when it gets into little bitty pieces. So like crushed. Segmental is when a segment actually breaks out. A vulsed is when one of the edges of the bone actually breaks off. Spiral is like a twist. And then green stick means that just a portion, it's not broken all the way through. So how does our bone actually repair itself? Well, one thing is that we get a hematoma. A hematoma is a fancy word for a bruise, and it does that because of that blood supply, right? There are blood vessels moving through all parts of your bone. And so if you break a bone, it's going to cause those vessels to also break and therefore a lot of blood. Okay? Then we get what's called a fibrocartilaginous callus formation. Okay? And so you can see that we're going to get this sort of callus growing along the outside parts of it. It's going to start to harden a little bit. We're going to get some fibrous tissue and cartilage to be able to regrow through there. We're also going to see new blood vessels growing in. And we're going to get to see that spongy bone trabeculae starting to grow through. Then we get a bony callus formation because the blood area is going to actually start to harden. And then we're going to get that bone remodeling so that we can get the formation of the cavity, the medullary cavity again, and have spongy bone and compact bone. Okay. So calcium homeostasis. So calcium is actually required in the bone to form calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate salts in that hydroxyapatite lattice to make the bone hard. We have osteocalcin. Osteocalcin is synthesized by vitamin K, and that's needed for the calcium and the phosphate ions to become those crystals of hydroxyapatite. We also need vitamin D. So in order for our body to be able to absorb the calcium from our foods within our small intestines, we need to have vitamin D. So you can get vitamin D from the sun. However, in the area that we live, we don't actually have enough. You can also take supplemental vitamin Ds, or you can eat foods that are high in vitamin D. Okay. Now, there's different levels. We have hypocalcemia. Hypo means low. Calcemia means calcium, right? So low calcium. When we have low calcium or hypocalcemia, our blood has difficulty coagulating or clotting. The heart can actually stop beating or even skip beats. The muscles can have difficulty contracting. Your nerves may have difficulty functioning, and you also could get brittle bones, meaning that they're easy to break. Hypercalcemia means high calcium, and that can cause lethargy, sluggish reflexes, constipation, loss of appetite, confusion, and coma. Okay? So calcium, where do we get it? Most often we're going to get it from the foods that we eat, but again, we can't absorb it unless we have the right amounts of vitamin D. So our body works really hard to maintain homeostasis, and it does it using our endocrine system. Okay. And so when we have a rising blood calcium levels, meaning that we have a lot of calcium, maybe we've just eaten a bunch of cheese and yogurt and ice cream and milk. Okay. And when that happens, our thyroid gland, your thyroid gland is right at sort of the base of your throat. It releases calcitonin. Okay. Now, what does calcitonin actually do? Well, calcitonin actually stimulates the calcium to deposit into our bone. Okay, so we're going to stimulate those osteoblasts to build up more bone. It's also going to reduce the calcium uptake in our kidneys. Within our kidneys, we can actually reabsorb calcium rather than letting it go out into our urine. However, what it does in this case is that it's going to say, no, no, let that calcium go. We have enough. Okay. Then our blood calcium levels are going to decline to a set point, homeostasis. This would explain, maybe you've heard of kidney stones. Those are usually calcium deposits within the kidneys. Okay? And so too much calcium, we're not going to be able to reduce that calcium uptake in the kidneys. And so we can't let it out. Okay? Now, on the flip side, when we have falling blood calcium levels, meaning that we haven't had any calcium in our diet, our parathyroid gland, now the parathyroid gland is on the back surface of your thyroid. There's little nodules of different glandular tissue called the parathyroids. Those parathyroid glands are going to release, wait for it, parathyroid hormone. Woo! Parathyroid hormone is going to stimulate the calcium release from our bones, meaning that we're going to start to break down the bone, and we're going to stimulate the calcium uptake in the kidneys. It's going to say, hey, you know what? We don't have enough calcium within our body, so stop letting it go out in our urine. Instead, reabsorb it back in. We also get the activation of vitamin D, and so that's going to increase calcium uptake in our intestines. So as we eat that calcium, we're going to absorb more of it instead of letting it go out in our stool. And that allows our blood calcium levels to rise back up to our set point. So there are some surface features of our bones, and surface features actually result from the bones being attached to our ligaments and our tendons. Ligaments attach bone to bone, tendons attach muscle to bone. Okay? It also results from our blood vessels and our nerves coming into contact with our bones. So we get what are called bone markings from this. Okay, and so we get trochanters, we get the head of the bone, the neck of the bone, we get facets and tubercles and condyles. We get processes, foramen, sinuses, fissures, ramus. We get tubercles and sulci, or just one sulcus. A neck, we get tuberosities, fossa, trochlea, condyles. Okay, this is a humerus, that's a femur. This is the pelvis. We get fossas and crests and spines and lines and foramens and ramuses. And that's a lot of things that we get. So what is each one of them? Well, this is some introduction to some bone markings. So elevations and projections, we would have a process or a ramus. So a process is really any projection or bump. A ramus is an extension of a bone making an angle with the rest of the structure. So the ramus of your mandible right here, the ramus of your pelvis right there, because it's forming an angle. Any other, wrongly. A process is just something that's sort of sticking out. Okay. We have trochanters, that are large, rough projections. We have tuberosities, which are smaller, rough projections. Tubercles, which are small, rounded projections. We have crests, which are prominent ridges. We have lines, which are low ridges. Spines, which are pointed. We have, these are areas for articulation of adjacent bones. So we have the head, like you have a head of a humerus and a head of a femur. It's like a ball and socket joint. We have the neck, which is a narrow connection between the epiphyses and the diaphysis. We have condyles, which are smooth, rounded articular processes. Trochleas, which are smooth, grooved articular processes. They're shaped like pulleys. We have facets, which are small, flat articular surfaces. Fossas, sulci, foramen, canal, meatus, fissure, and sinuses. So the key here is that you would know whether it's an opening, a depression, formed for articulation, for tendons and ligaments to attach, or for elevations and projections. So what is the reason that it has it? So how are you going to remember those bone markings? Well, you could make some flashcards if you'd like, right? You could put the anatomical term and then the general description or the definition or both on there. Okay, that's one idea. Make your own flashcards. You could make some mnemonic devices, fun songs, or rhymes that would help you to remember all of that. So can you discuss the general functions of the skeletal system? Name and locate the skeletal landmarks of the human skeleton, describe the general structure of the bones, and distinguish between compact and spongy bone in terms of microscopic structure and function and location. You know where to find me. If you have any questions, I am happy to help you. Thank you.